Hey folks, happy Thursday. This is a very unique opportunity we have here. This is a week where we happen to be shooting video. So if we did a camera pan, Owen from the video crew is over there, Chris from the video crew is over there, Andreas from the video crew is running the camera, and then Bob from Tight Bond Glue is over here. He's going to be on with us at 4 o'clock today. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. So the good news for you is that I don't have to run back and forth moving the camera. Andreas is going to do that for me. So it's going to be a super professional flow today, right, Andreas? Is that the promise?
Sure.
All right. A couple business things. So let's hit first on that 4 o'clock live we have today. So really unique opportunity. Bob is the technical manager, right? Technical service manager from Tight Bond Glue in Ohio. Remember, I'm in Wisconsin. He drove 11 billion hours yesterday to get here. So at 4 o'clock today, if you've got glue questions, this is when you want to tune in. Stuff that we get all the time. Paul and I at WWGOA, what's the shelf life of my glue? How do I know if it's gone bad? My glue froze. Can I still use it? What's the benefit of Tight Bond Original versus 2 versus 3? So all of that stuff and more, right? And more will be available to you at 4 o'clock today. The other thing is, it's only August. There's a lot of sitting outside season left. One of the favorite projects I have done for WWGOA is an Adirondack chair. We have got that PDF and video plan available for you. One of the things I love about that, if you've ever seen an Adirondack chair, the arms are curvy, the legs are curvy, it's full of curves, that's part of the appeal. And we have got full-size templates for all those parts. So you take the PDF, you go to like a Kinko's or something, you get that printed, and you have full-size patterns for all of the Adirondack chair components. So it makes the build a lot easier to do. And the chair itself I like because there's a curve in the seat for your butt. There's a curve in the back for your back. If you look at a lot of Adirondack chairs, the seat is straight, the back is straight. It's angled like this, but it's straight across. So they're not very comfortable to sit in. This one is so comfortable to sit in, you can nap in it for a really long time, he says, from experience. So I'm going to look at preguntas to start with to see, and then I'm going to start talking. I think there were already some Resaw related questions here. So okay. So we've got a couple of hellos. Bob, and then Robert is in Milwaukee. Charles is in Belize. So that's very cool. It's one of the neat things about these lives is they go everywhere. And we actually have a remarkably big international audience on our live streams. Clay was in Traverse City. He's telling us his travels there. Upper Michigan is nice. Upper Michigan is amazing. They don't believe in road repairs. Bob is kind of from that part of the country. We did a motorcycle trip there last year. They don't believe in signs or road repairs. In Wisconsin, you can't go 5 miles and not run into a gas station, a bar, and a church. And we went about 100 miles in Michigan and couldn't find a place to have lunch. So Larry says, Alex Snodgrass says, if your bandsaw is properly tuned, you won't have drift. Do you have any comment on that? Yeah, I don't know. Here's, and then Larry maybe says the same thing twice, or a different Larry. I know Alex very well. And in my experience with a bandsaw, what I'm about to show you to check for drift is very, very easy to do. And I think it's worth it as a preemptive strike when I'm about to resaw a bunch of expensive stuff to do this little check, set my fence, and cut that way. I don't disagree with Alex, and I think my bandsaw is tuned pretty well. We'll see what happens on our drift cut or on our resaw cut here today. But it's, I don't know, it's a your mileage may vary kind of a thing. For me, I've always done what I'm about to do when I'm getting ready to resaw. Nicer G says, would love to join the glue talk. Is there a link? By the way, I'm all the way a Tight Bond guy. Love Tight Bond 1, 2, and 3. So could you, Max, could you just put a link in the comments, please, for the 4 o'clock session? And then Arcania's workshop, Kaisha's in South Carolina, where Bob used to live, right? Or North Carolina. North Carolina. Arcania's workshop says, just proper setup for resawing. I can't seem to get consistent thickness. All right. So we are ready to talk resawing, I think. Here's the deal. Resawing means that most likely, instead of cutting on the flat like this, you're going to cut a board like this. That's the direction that we're going to go today. We're going to put a fence on the bandsaw and we're going to make those cuts. In addition to resawing, the benefit I see with this is that when this is set up right, you can use your bandsaw just like your table saw. In my shop, when my kids were little and first learning woodworking, they did all their rip cuts on a bandsaw. There's no kickback on a bandsaw. The blade is driving down toward the table, not back at you. So it was much safer for them to start their ripping career here on the bandsaw. The other benefit to it is the kerf on a bandsaw blade. This blade is about 32 thousandths. Even on a thin kerf saw blade, it's closer to an 1/8 inch, 125 thousandths. So if I'm cutting something really expensive, I'd rather send less dust up the dust chute. So the thinner kerf of a bandsaw blade is a benefit. And then also, if I'm cutting small parts, pen blanks are a great example. 3/4 by 3/4 by maybe 2 is what you want for a pen blank. I do all of that here on the bandsaw, producing the 3/4 by 3/4 and doing the cross cut, which is not a fence related operation, but I'm just saying, I find it much safer to cut those small pieces on a bandsaw than on a miter saw. So there are a lot of good compelling reasons, I think, for getting to where you can accurately set your fence on a bandsaw. Part of what that comes down to is we want a fence with drift compensation. So on this fence, I'm using a Laguna bandsaw, Laguna fence. There are 3 bolts that connect the head to the body. When those are loose, they move independently of each other. So as a result, when this is locked on the pipe on the front of the bandsaw table, I'll be able to make some adjustment in the fence if I need to. We'll see how that goes once we get that far. Blade selection, if you could go there, Andres. You want to have a good aggressive cut. So again, this is, likening this to a table saw. You're not going to put an 80 tooth blade on your table saw to do a rip cut. You're going to put a 24 to 40 tooth blade on your table saw. So this is a wide blade. It's a 1/2 inch wide. It's 3 to 4 TPI, teeth per inch. We want to have a good big gullet in here. This resaw operation is going to make big chips. Just like a rip blade handsaw, just like a rip blade on your table saw, those big gullets are there to carry those big chips out of the cut when we cut with the grain, resawing. So we want to have that big aggressive tooth pattern. This particular blade, I know people are going to ask, this is a Timberwolf brand. It's a Timberwolf low tension blade. I've been using these in my shop all around, not just for resawing, for everything, for a really, really long time. And I really like these Timberwolves. To do this, we're going to start with a piece of scrap. This is going to be our test cut. The only thing that's critical about this is that we need to have a line that's parallel to a straight edge. I ran this edge on my joiner. So to make that line, all I'm going to do is that with my finger. You could measure and mark, connect the dots, whatever you got to do. This line has to be parallel to this edge. Now, because you're here, or wherever you are, I'm going to put masking tape on the table because that's all about you who are watching. Normally, the step where I'm going to reference the masking tape, I'm just working off the cast iron, but I want to make it a little bit easier for you to see what I'm talking about. So here's what I'm going to do to get this rolling. I'm going to turn on the saw, and I'm going to start following that pencil line I just made. And as I do, it could be that I have to cant the board a little bit this way or cant the board a little bit this way in order to follow the straight line. That's the drift of the blade. If I really exaggerate, if that blade is sitting in there like this, to cut a straight line, I got to push parallel to the blade. So in the first probably half of this board, I'm going to be finding the angle at which I need to feed in order to cut straight. So a reference I've made a few times in my life when I teach this is, it's like when I owned an 81 Citation K-body car, and for that car to go down the road, it was going down the road straight as far as the steering was concerned, but it was like the back end was always trying to catch up to the front end and kind of dog-legged down the road. So what's going to happen is I'm going to start cutting. I'm going to find how I have to feed. Somewhere about here, I'm going to stop, freeze the board, talk about the next step. So I know from your angle, it's a little hard to tell. I would say I might be just like 1 degree off of parallel to the miter gauge slot. This is real important. Freezing it in place is really important. Let the blade come to a stop or step on your brake. In that position, I'm going to trace that straight edge onto the table, or in this case, onto the masking tape. And then this can come out. So, Andreas, I don't know if it's possible from that angle. There's a pencil line there. So like I said, normally if I'm just working by myself, I do that right on the cast iron. That line shows us the drift angle that we need to incorporate in the fence in order to track parallel to the blade. Next step, get the fence up out of the way. Or sorry, the upper guide out of the way. I was just waiting for one of the crew to correct me on that. No one did. Then I'm going to get close to the line, lock the head on this front end, on my end, locking the head in place. And then because of the way the fence is made, it's wiggly. So I can take advantage of that wiggle to now position it on the pencil line that I just created and lock the fence at that angle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to test this. Then we're going to come back and look. I'll stop a second and look at questions before I go into an actual resaw. We'll get caught up with your questions. Before I put my big piece of birch on here and try the resaw, we want to know if this is right. So to do that, I'm going to bring this back in place. And it doesn't matter at this stage where the fence is locked. All I'm going to do is rip that piece of poplar. And what I'm looking for is one of three things are going to happen. If everything is perfect, this is simply going to feed, stay against the fence, and we're going to be able to make this cut. Or it's possible that as I'm cutting, the outfeed end pulls a little bit away from the fence. For that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut, let go, cut, let go, and I'm watching to see if that springs away from the fence. Alternatively, as I cut, if it feels or sounds like it's starting to bind, that's the other symptom I'm looking for. If it's springing off the fence, the angle is such that the back of the fence is too far that way, to my left. If it sounds like it's binding, the back of the fence is too far to the right. If it feeds okie and dokie, then we're set and we can try the birch. So cut a little bit, let go, cut a little bit. It's definitely not springing off the fence. So that cut really well. Pretty common questions with this. You could zoom back out, Andreas, and I'll grab my iPad too. Pretty common questions I usually get from this, like, does this test material have to be the same as the real material? No, I would stay in the same family, like hardwood, but this is poplar. I'm about to cut birch. That's going to work just fine. Your test cut doesn't have to be a Resaw. We can cut on the flat like this, and if it works like this, it's going to work when we do a bigger, more aggressive Resaw. All right, let me look for questions. Well, Max, this is the weirdest thing ever. I got like a CAPTCHA on the live page. It's telling me I have to type letters in, I don't know, to prove I'm a human, I guess. I have never had this happen before. Give me a sec. This is weird. Well, yeah, it's not letting me, even though I'm typing in, it's one of these, like I said, a CAPTCHA kind of a thing where it's making me type in letters. And I'm doing the right letters, but it's not.
Checking for circuitry.
Something. Are questions showing up on your screen, Andres?
Max says to try to refresh the page.
Yeah, that was my first step. I've done that 3 or 4 times.
No questions.
All right. So Max, if people are asking questions on any of the channels, put them in. There's a chat role, I think, in the computer screen that Andreas is looking at. Put them there. I've submitted these CAPTCHA letters, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 times, and it's still not letting me in there. So that part of this is not going to work. You good, Andreas?
Yeah. Good.
You said, okay. So what we're going to do, the end game, is to get this piece of birch resawn through its center here. Couple things for setup. You want to have a push pad handy. Even with all this setup right, we don't want to take the chance that blade could exit the cut. So this is going to be against the face instead of your hand against the face. The other thing you'll see me use is a featherboard. I love these. The product is mag switch. What that's all about is there's a switch and a switch. When I turn it on and on, it's activating magnets. So anything you have that's magnetable, anything that's cast iron, this will grab onto. So you'll see when I put it on the table, I can position it, get it against my birch, lock it, and the magnets hold it. So again, Mag Switch is the product name, and they make a lot of different stuff, including a bandsaw fence. You can also buy just the switches separately if you want to incorporate them into your own jigs. When you put this on, we never want to have pressure on the blade. So this is just like the way I would set this up on a table saw, which is.
There are some questions on the private chat.
Okay, I'll get to this set of the setup and then we'll come to questions. I'm going to position my fence where I want to do the resaw. The magnetic featherboard has to be in front of the blade. So you don't want it to be there because you're going to push on the blade. It's going to be somewhere about there. put some pressure on it, turn it on, a little pressure, turn it on, and now that's locked onto the table. All right, if you would be so kind, sir, as to read any lovely questions.
Yeah. Kevin, one Yanks says, what's the advantage, disadvantage of using a wider blade, 1 to 1.5 wide blade versus a smaller blade like the one you're using right now?
So I know in this Timberwolf brand blade, if you're resawing kiln-dried wood, which I am, they recommend a 1/2-inch blade. In broad strokes, the wider you go with the blade, the better it's going to track. Think about what we're doing here. I'm about to cut, I don't know, a 10-inch width. If we have a narrow blade on there, it's going to have a tendency to flex away from the cut. So what we really want, we want the rigidity, the stiffness that a wider blade brings to it. It's going to have more spine, so that when you have cutting pressure on the front, it's going to cut. It's not just constantly flexing away from the cutting pressure.
Angie says, Carter has a fence alignment system tool that is designed to help you align your bandsaw fence more accurately. Various bars with magnets that attach to the blade. You then align your fence to the magnetic bar. Thoughts?
Yes. So the question is about a Carter product, and the way it works is that if I had a ruler, it's basically just a little piece of steel. It's got a magnet on it. So it's doing the same as what I just did experientially, which is it goes on the blade and it's going to sit wherever the blade is kittywampus. If the blade is spun just a couple of degrees in this direction, it magnifies that because it's a longer piece of metal. I've never used it. Intuitively, it makes sense to me because it's doing what we just did. Like I said, when I started, I've been doing this little test cut business for as long as I've been resawing. And when I'm not talking and explaining my way through it, the stuff that I just showed you in like 90 seconds, I've done the test cut, I've set the fence, and I'm ready to go. So for me, that approach works fine. But I understand the mechanics of what that Carter product would bring to the table. And like I said, it makes sense to me.
Dennis says, I am interested in resawing to make my own veneer to using face frames for cabinet making. One question is, how big of a cut is feasible? I have a 19-inch grizzly and can go to 12 inches. I'm interested in 12-inch for side of cabinet refacing. Thanks.
So basically, I guess the question is like, how much can you resaw? So like, how much could a resaw cut if a resaw could cut wood? Right? Was that the question, Andreas, basically? So if this is a 13-inch capacity, I would have no problem plowing through 13 inches. If you've got a 12-inch capacity, you should be able to cut 12 inches.
Rob says, would that fence be similar to the Grizzly tall fence?
I don't know how similar or dissimilar. I've not seen the Grizzly fence. As long as, so basically the bolts that hold the fence to the head are in oversized holes. That's the feature. So that allows them to wiggle independently. I'm currently set. After I've made this cut, I'll show you another feature of this fence that I like. I know the Craig aftermarket fence, I've put that on other bandsaws I've owned. That also allows you to do drift compensation, and it also allows the other thing I'm going to show you. So the Craig aftermarket fence, which is compatible with many different bandsaws, don't ask me which ones, they can tell you that, is also a good way. If you don't have a good fence on your bandsaw, that Craig fence is a good way to go.
Bill says, have you ever used a 3/4 or 1-inch wide blade to resaw? Any advantage?
So have I used bigger blades? Yes. I've got a second bandsaw that is always set up like a sawmill. I think some of you know I have an addiction to finding logs and making them into stuff. I have a pile of wood that someday I'll use or I'll die and never use that is pretty significant. That saw it's a bigger saw than this. So it's got, I think, a 1-inch 2 TPI blade on it. So yeah, it's again, stiffer blade. You can go feed a little faster. You can push a little harder. It gives you more, the blade has more rigidity.
Chris says, what causes drift to begin with? Why not fix that issue?
That's a great question. So on your table saw, one of the first things you did was you put the blade on, you aligned the blade to the miter gauge slot, then you align the fence to the miter gauge slot. Everything was smurferific, and it's that way pretty much forever, unless you have some kind of catastrophic thing. You're not going through this every time you use a table saw, because the mechanics of how that works is dialed in way tighter than what we're doing here. On a bandsaw, there's a crown on the tires. Is this 1/2-inch blade currently sitting in exactly the same spot on that crown as it was last time? Is it tensioned exactly the same? Is the weld on it exactly the same as the previous 1/2-inch blade I used? So the difference between this and the table saw is there are a bunch of factors that change the setup kind of microscopically, but every one of those adds up to some amount of drift or not. I mean, it's very possible that when you do that cut, it is cutting perfectly straight to the miter gauge slot, or parallel to the miter gauge slot, but there's no predictability there. So there's not a fix. And again, Alex Snodgrass is an amazing bandsaw operator, so I'm not talking down anything that he says or does. I just don't have any experience with his setup. For me, it's not about fixing the bandsaw. It's about doing that little drift check every time I use it.
Ross Hornick says, what about keeping 4 to 5 teeth buried in the stock to prevent blade damage?
So a general rule of thumb when you're choosing tooth count is to have 4 teeth in the material. When you're cutting a 10-inch wide board, it ain't going to happen, because what would that, I don't know what the tooth count would have to be. You'd have to have like, I'm not doing the math in my head. You can't do it. So it works when you're cutting thin stuff, like a 4-tooth blade works good for 3/4 inch stock. A 10-tooth per inch blade works great for really, really thin metal, which I frequently cut on my bandsaw, non-ferrous metal. So it works, the formula works for that. It doesn't work for resawing.
Clay says, what about blade tension, flex, etc.?
So yeah, this is all, what about blade tension and flex? Everything I'm doing is predicated on you got to put a blade correctly on your bandsaw and get the tension set. With these Timberwolf blades, there's a procedure that's outlined on the back of the package. They run at a little bit less tension than a conventional bimetal blade does, and it's all outlined on there how you set that tension. I'm going to show you, after we make this cut, I'm going to show you a symptom you can look for that would tell you you have a tension deficit.
Ely.
No one in the room giggled at that. Andreas did a tiny bit.
In your demo, how far off square was your fence after the setup?
I'm maybe 1 degree off of parallel.
Dennis says, being resawing today, Jet 18 ES?
Something. Jet bandsaw, okay.
With new 5/8 of an inch 3-tooth blade. Bandsaw all tuned up, but still having a hard time pushing through maple. My throat plate is only as wide as the blade. Should it be wider for dust?
Throat plate as wide as the blade. I don't get. So it seems like 2 questions. Is it a dust question and a resawing question? So, I mean, you could observe here, this is a 110 volt bandsaw with, I think, a 1 3/4 horse motor on it and a 324 TPI 1/2-inch blade. And I'm about to cut birch, which isn't quite as hard as maple, but yeah, it should, I would expect, I mean, here's the thing. It's like any cut, you got to listen to the tool. So you're asking a lot of a bandsaw to cut a full 10, 12, 13-inch resaw of hard maple or hickory or, God forbid, Osage orange. Can you get 12-inch wide pieces of Osage orange? I don't know. But those are very hard woods. You've got to listen to the saw, because if you have everything set up right, but you push too hard, the blade is going to deflect, and that's going to screw up your resaw. So you got to pay attention to the machine as you go. But I would expect any bandsaw with the right blade to be able to cut through 10 or 12 inches of maple at an appropriate feed rate.
Larry says, is a wider blade better for resaw than a narrow blade?
Yes.
Okay. Dan says, if you tension the blade more or less, does that change the drift?
It can. So that's the part of, there's all these different factors here. Did I tension this exactly the same way as I did the last time it was on the saw? So the point of that being, if I take this blade off and do other stuff with my bandsaw, put this blade back on, I'm still going to do that drift check before I make any cuts, because maybe it's tensioned slightly differently. Maybe it's on the crown on those tires slightly differently. So the answer to all of those questions is every time I put a blade on and I'm fixing to resaw, I do that little drift check.
David says, manufacturer of the fence you're using.
This fence came with the Laguna bandsaw.
And Rob says, so do we need to adjust the miter gauge as well?
I never use a miter gauge on my bandsaw, but if it's if the miter gauge isn't tracking parallel to the blade, you could have an issue, but I use a little crosscut sled on here sometimes, but that's not something I've run into. It's not, I would think, it's not as critical as like on a table saw. That's part of that setup. You've got to have your miter gauge slot parallel to the table saw blade. Because a bandsaw blade is so narrow, you could probably get away with that not being quite perfect. I'm certainly not going to take the time to loosen the trunnion bolts on this cast iron. You know, theoretically, you'd have to do that drift check, loosen those trunnion bolts, and then spin the table a little bit one way or the other to get the miter gauge slot parallel to the blade. That's not a kind of a cut that I make on my bandsaw, so I'm not worried about it. Clear? All right, so magnetic featherboard. That's going to help hold against the fence. Listen to the feed rate so you don't overfeed. Push stick at the ready, push pad at the ready, so that I can use that instead of my hand. When I get close to the end, I quit pushing here because I don't want to take any chance of being here when that blade exits. 3 teeth per inch would do a lot of damage to your hand. So I switch to pulling from back here, or switch to pulling. All right, now the big reveal. One of the things that's cool about mastering resawing, in addition to using your bandsaw like a table saw, which I very routinely do, is we get a book match pattern when they're done. That is a particularly lovely piece of birch. So gluing these two boards together like this, then that pattern is mirrored each side. I told you after we resaw, one of the things I'll do is show you a symptom you can look for that the blade doesn't have enough tension. That would be take that cut surface and put a straight edge on it. And if there's a bow in that surface, if the straight edge isn't touching all the way across, then that's called a barrel cut. And your bandsaw blade does not have enough tension on it. That's usually the symptom of that. So that looks great there. And two, like I said, that just watching that feed rate in this birch gives you an idea of what you should be able to expect from the right blade in your bandsaw to make these cuts. All right, anything else there, Andreas?
Nothing here, sir.
All right, so I'll tap dance a little in case anybody has any other last minute questions. So one, Adirondack chair plan, which is a very, very cool project, is available. You just got to scroll down a little bit, click the link. And again, what I love about that is when I did that project, we created a PDF of full-size templates. So it really simplifies getting all those curvy parts that you need in order to make an Adirondack chair. Tonight, don't forget, or later today, in 4.5 hours, 4 o'clock Central Time, Bob, who's right there, come on, Bob, come on in. Promote yourself.
How you doing?
I'm Mike, he is not. Bob from Type On is in my shop. We're going to do some video work with him now. At 4 o'clock, he's going to be live. What are you going to talk about?
We'll talk about anything that you guys want to talk about.
Oh, how about glue?
Mostly glue, hopefully.
So 4 o'clock Central Time today, bring your sticky questions.
That's right. And don't be tacky about it.
Oh, very good. All right, I'm going to steal that one. And Andreas says we have two more questions. Dos más preguntas. Am I getting this right?
That's
Andreas is helping me with my Espanol all week. Dos preguntas. All right.
Leonard asked, after setting the fans, how do you keep it parallel to the blade when you move it to the correct width of cut?
Okay, so part of the benefit to this whole system is that it's a T-square style fence, just like on your table saw. So once this is set to that drift angle, what's coolio, Julio, is that I can put it there. It's still parallel to the drift. I can put it there. It's still parallel to the drift. And I did say, I'm going to show you another feature I like about this fence. Even if I do this, it's still parallel to the drift. The benefit to this is if I'm cutting those pen blanks, 3/4 by 3/4, and I'm in the high fence position, come on. If I'm in that high fence position and I'm 3/4 by 3/4, I can't get this upper guide all the way down here. When I lay the fence down in this position, I can cut thin stock and I can get that upper guide close to the material like you should. So once we set for drift, that angle is now incorporated into the head and fence assembly, and it doesn't matter where I put the fence. It's good to go.
And Chris says, any thoughts on sharpening bandsaw blades? Do you do it? Recommend technique?
I don't. I sharpen them by putting on a new one. So I've never tried it. Industrially, my friend Charlie's got a wood miser. Those bandsaw blades get sharpened, but they're also like 2 inches wide and have gullets the size of the Grand Canyon. So conventional bandsaw blades like this, I just replace. All right, we're good for questions. Bob and I will see you at 4 bells later today. And I think that's all we have for announcements. Grab that Adirondack chair plan, and we'll see you in about 4.5 hours.